A World on the Edge, December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941. Early morning sunlight glints off the calm waters of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The air is thick with humidity and the faint scent of diesel from docked battleships. Sailors stretch and yawn, unaware that their routines are about to be shattered. The distant hum of aircraft engines gradually grows louder, a mechanical roar that cuts through the stillness. Lieutenant Commander James Halstead adjusts his cap, scanning the horizon from the deck of the USS Arizona. Across the harbor, sailors chat idly about football scores and upcoming shore leave, oblivious to the swarm of Japanese aircraft approaching at over 200 miles per hour. The first torpedo splashes into the water, missed by all but the sharpest eyes, and immediately the harbor erupts into chaos. Smoke rises from the USS Oklahoma as sailors scramble for cover. Explosions rock the decks of the USS West Virginia, sending shrapnel and water skyward. Now, imagine for a moment that America had chosen differently. That the United States, despite this attack, had not declared war, had refused to enter the conflict in Europe or the Pacific. Imagine the tension in the harbor still unfolding, yet the nation holding back, its military leaders restrained, Congress reluctant, citizens divided. Sailors duck for cover, sailors shout orders, but no immediate plan of retaliation is enacted. The Japanese strike goes unchallenged in the immediate sense, the U.S. Navy crippled, but not yet a combatant in the global theater. The world beyond Pearl Harbor shifts imperceptibly at first. London's war rooms buzz with intelligence reports from intercepted transmissions. German generals read the news with sly, calculating glances. Hitler's ambitions in Europe suddenly appear less constrained. The Soviet Union, already battered on the Eastern Front, watches anxiously, unsure if the American industrial and military machine will ever tip the scales against the Axis. On the streets of Washington, D.C., citizens gather around radios hearing President Roosevelt's measured address. Words are chosen carefully, crafted to calm and inspire. Yet in this alternate scenario, Congress hesitates. Isolationist sentiment, still strong from the interwar years, gains a foothold. The nation mourns Pearl Harbor, yes, but there is no immediate call to arms, no declaration of war. Instead, America fortifies its coasts, invests in preparedness, and debates the cost of entering a war across the oceans. And so, the gears of history begin to turn differently. The Axis powers sense opportunity. Japan consolidates its grip on Southeast Asia, free from fear of an American counterstrike. Germany, unpressured by an eventual Allied surge, strengthens its hold over Western Europe, reallocates resources that would have gone to fighting the Soviets, and contemplates bold new offensives. The stage is set for a world where the United States' decision, or indecision, reshapes the battlefield before a single shot is fired across the Atlantic.
Europe's unchecked ambitions. Winter 1941, Berlin. December chills seep into Berlin as Adolf Hitler paces the ornate study of the Reich Chancellery. Maps of Europe stretch across the walls, pins marking victories, advances, and strategic positions. The reports from the Eastern Front arrive sporadically. Soviet resistance has proven stubborn, yet with America restrained, German high command senses a chance to consolidate their gains without fearing a second front in the West. Hitler's eyes gleam with the dangerous satisfaction of opportunity. The United States, the most industrially potent nation on earth, sits silently, undecided, while his armies occupy France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. Generals like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl confer in hushed tones, discussing how best to exploit the absence of American intervention. Supplies, once earmarked for defense, are redirected to new offensives, fortifying the Atlantic Wall, stockpiling tanks, and strengthening Luftwaffe reserves. There is a boldness now in strategy that might never have existed if the U.S. had pressed for war. Britain, embattled and weary from relentless bombings, stands alone. Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivers stirring speeches warning of an increasingly emboldened Axis, but his appeals for broader Allied coordination fall on ears unready to act. The American voice, which could have tipped the scales, remains silent. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the harsh Russian winter bites, and Soviet troops brace for another year of attrition. In this alternate scenario, German forces liberated from the pressing threat of American supply and manpower might now launch winter offensives more aggressively. Hitler's generals speculate, without U.S. intervention, could the Soviet Union finally collapse under pressure? The possibilities swirl through war rooms from Berlin to occupied Paris. The European theater, poised on a knife's edge, becomes a chessboard where the missing piece is the United States. Factories in the Ruhr churn weapons that may never be countered by American industry. Submarines prowl the Atlantic with less fear of attack. Meanwhile, intelligence officers pore over intercepted messages from Washington, noting not the declaration of war, but the calculated hesitation. Across the continent, the absence of the U.S. prompts whispers of opportunity, daring plans, and dangerous overconfidence that will echo in battles yet to come. The Pacific expands. Early 1942, Southeast Asia. The humid air of the Malayan jungle clings to every surface, carrying the distant rumbles of artillery and the sharp cries of birds startled by movement in the undergrowth. Japanese forces, emboldened by the lack of American opposition, advance swiftly through Malaya and into the Dutch East Indies. Tanks crush rice paddies, while paratroopers secure key ports almost unopposed. The strategic islands, rich in oil and rubber, are crucial to Japan's ambitions, and the absence of U.S. naval engagement allows Tokyo to extend its grip without fear of immediate American counterattacks. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto walks the deck of his flagship, studying the maps that outline the vast expanse of the Pacific. Without America's entry into the war, he contemplates bolder campaigns, perhaps even a direct push toward Australia or New Zealand. Japanese pilots train relentlessly, their morale high. The skies, unchecked by U.S. carriers, become a proving ground for daring dogfights and innovative maneuvers. Intelligence reports indicate Western colonies scrambling defensively, but without American industrial support, they are limited in their response. On the islands of the Philippines, locals watch as Japanese troops occupy towns and airfields. Filipino guerrillas prepare for resistance, but the American promise of reinforcements is absent. Messages arrive sporadically from Manila, expressing desperation. In this timeline, the archipelago is left largely to fend for itself. Cities are taken quickly, and the Empire of Japan consolidates control with a speed and precision that would have been nearly impossible had U.S. forces been directly involved. Back in Tokyo, military planners celebrate what they term a golden opportunity. The Pacific War, once envisioned as a long-term gamble against a powerful industrial nation, now seems winnable. Supply chains flow smoothly from conquered territories, fueling further expansion. Yet even as victories mount, there is an undercurrent of strategic tension, the realization that eventually industrial nations like Britain or a neutral U.S. could still tip the balance. Still, for the moment, Japan moves freely, carving a sprawling empire across the Pacific while the rest of the world watches, waiting for a power that has chosen restraint. Britain's lonely struggle. Mid-1942, London. The grey London sky is pierced by the persistent drone of Luftwaffe bombers, their silhouettes blotting out the faint winter sunlight. Streaks of black smoke curl upward from rooftops as incendiary bombs ignite entire neighborhoods. Citizens huddle in underground shelters, gripping one another as the walls tremble under relentless bombardment. Winston Churchill, framed against maps and dispatches in the cabinet war rooms, paces with a mixture of determination and unease. Every report from the front lines, every intercepted signal reminds him that the United States, whose industrial might could have tilted the scales, is still absent. Generals and intelligence officers meet in rapid succession. The British Army, stretched thin from North Africa to home defense, scrambles to anticipate the next German offensive. Supply lines are fragile, convoys are vulnerable to U-boat attacks in the Atlantic. Every delay in reinforcement feels magnified. Every tactical misstep carries monumental consequences. Churchill's voice rises over the din of strategy sessions. Britain must stand alone if necessary, yet he knows that without U.S. entry, the weight of the Axis threat grows exponentially. Across the English Channel, German forces observe with calculated patience. Hitler's advisors push for renewed offensives along the coast, testing weak points in coastal defenses while air raids soften British infrastructure. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force scrambles daily sorties to protect the homeland, but without American aircraft or production support, replacement planes arrive too slowly, and pilot fatigue rises alarmingly. Civilian morale, bolstered by speeches and propaganda, faces relentless pressure, and the question on everyone's mind becomes, how long can Britain resist before the tides of the Axis overwhelm the island? In this alternate history, London embodies a paradoxical tension, an indomitable spirit constrained by isolation. Citizens light candles in the blacked-out streets, children memorize the rumble of air raid sirens, and every bomb dropped serves as a reminder of the precarious balance of power. The United States, so distant yet so critical, remains on the sidelines, observing but not intervening, leaving Britain to navigate a world where hope and survival must exist without the guarantee of Allied intervention. The Eastern Front shifted. Summer 1942, Moscow. The bitter winds that had battered Moscow in the winter had softened into a warm, sweltering summer, yet tension hung as thick as the humid air. Soviet commanders, already stretched by months of fighting, reviewed reports that chilled even the most seasoned strategists. German forces, freed from the threat of American involvement, had poured more men and resources into the Eastern Front. Panzer divisions moved with unprecedented speed, artillery barrages decimating defensive positions along the western approaches to the city. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, pacing a dimly lit command tent, clenched his fists as he considered the implications. Without the United States pressuring Germany from the west, Moscow faced an Axis juggernaut far stronger than in actual history. Supply shortages plagued Soviet troops, and reinforcements were limited. Winter tactics were insufficient without American Lend-Lease support reaching the front lines. The Red Army's counteroffensives, once timed to exploit overstretched German supply lines, faltered under the sheer weight of concentration and planning of German high command. Meanwhile, German generals debated their next move. Should they push for a full encirclement of Moscow or focus on securing resource-rich territories further south? Confidence radiated through the Wehrmacht. The absence of American forces meant that any prolonged conflict would favor Germany's ability to allocate troops efficiently, with fewer diversions in Western Europe or North Africa. Hitler's staff meticulously calculated that without U.S. intervention, the Soviets could be gradually worn down, a campaign of attrition made possible by the restraint of a nation across the Atlantic. The citizens of Moscow, too, felt the looming threat. Air raid sirens blared with increasing frequency, ration lines stretched longer, and underground shelters overflowed. In classrooms and offices alike, whispers circulated about the United States' potential role, but in this timeline, that hope remained distant. The city braced for what could become the decisive summer of the war on the Eastern Front, a battle shaped not only by tanks and guns, but by the absence of an entire nation's industrial and military might.
North Africa's turning tide, late 1942, El Alamein. The sun scorches the sands of North Africa, turning the landscape into a shimmering, heat-blurred expanse. Dust chokes the air as British and German troops maneuver across the desert, each side aware that the stakes here stretch far beyond the dunes. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, scans his lines from atop a sand dune, binoculars in hand, noting the positions of British armor and artillery. With the United States absent from the conflict, Rommel's supplies remain uninterrupted, and reinforcements arrive more reliably from Europe. His confidence, tempered only by the unforgiving desert and the resilience of British forces, grows daily. General Bernard Montgomery, pacing behind his forward command post, recognizes the precariousness of his position. Intelligence reports hint that American forces, who historically would have supplied vast amounts of tanks, trucks, and air support, are no longer coming. Every armored advance and every supply convoy is now a calculated gamble. Soldiers sweat under the sun, relying solely on British ingenuity and dwindling resources to hold the line. The morale of the troops is tested as Rommel's mechanized divisions press relentlessly, capitalizing on an axis that now enjoys a broader margin for strategic experimentation without American interference. From Cairo, dispatches fly to Cairo and back, detailing skirmishes, ambushes, and the ebb and flow of desert warfare. Civilians in nearby towns and oases live under the constant shadow of conflict, witnessing German motorized columns roar past, their objectives clear and unopposed by the might of the U.S. military. In this alternate scenario, North Africa becomes a proving ground not just for tactics, but for the larger implications of a world where America's industrial and military power remains untapped in the Allied arsenal. Rommel, sensing opportunity, contemplates bold maneuvers that might have been impossible in the real timeline. With no American pressure from across the Atlantic, the Axis could aim to seize the Suez Canal, cut off Middle Eastern oil supplies, and potentially force Britain into a strategic concession. Every decision on these sands carries the weight of an altered world, a world where one nation's restraint reshapes the global balance of power in ways no soldier could fully predict. The Battle of the Atlantic, early 1943, North Atlantic. The North Atlantic is a restless expanse, gray waves crashing against steel hulls of convoys as icy winds lash sailors' faces. Merchant ships, laden with supplies for Britain, cut through fog and spray, unaware of the lurking threat beneath the waves. German U-boats, operating with alarming freedom, stalk these convoys with little fear of American escort carriers that historically would have turned the tide. The absence of the United States in the war leaves the Allies struggling to protect vital shipping lanes, and the wolf packs exploit every weakness. Captain Karl-Heinz Müller, aboard U-123, adjusts his periscope as the silhouette of an Allied freighter emerges from the mist. Orders come swiftly, torpedo tubes ready, course plotted. Every sinking of cargo-laden ships not only depletes Britain's supplies, but demonstrates how the Atlantic, a theater historically contested by combined Allied naval power, now tilts in Germany's favor. Allied sailors struggle, relying on outdated convoys and limited air patrols. Morale wavers. The Atlantic's vastness amplifies the sense of isolation. Back in London, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound reviews intercepted communications and grimly notes the increase in Allied losses. Without American destroyers, sonar technology, and aircraft carriers flooding the Atlantic, the Royal Navy's ability to respond is severely limited.
Every report underscores a simple truth. The absence of U.S. intervention is no longer a theoretical disadvantage, it is a strategic crisis. Supplies for Britain, already stretched thin in North Africa and home defense, face delays that ripple through the entire war effort. In Berlin, the German High Command observes this success with satisfaction. The U-boat campaign, historically hindered by America's industrial and naval surge, now achieves near maximal efficiency. Plans are drawn to expand operations, targeting convoys heading toward Europe from North America, confident that resistance is minimal. For sailors, soldiers, and civilians alike, the Atlantic becomes a deadly corridor, a stark reminder that the decision of one nation to remain neutral or restrained can reshape the theater of war across thousands of miles of ocean. Snow falls relentlessly across Moscow, coating the streets and military installations in a pristine yet unforgiving white. Soviet troops, exhausted and low on supplies, struggle to hold defensive positions against relentless German offensives. With no U.S. aid arriving, no tanks, no aircraft, no Lend-Lease shipments, the Red Army relies almost entirely on domestic production and strained logistics. Commanders coordinate desperate counterattacks, yet the weight of German mechanized divisions pushes them into a defensive posture that seems increasingly hopeless. Marshal Zhukov reviews maps under dim lamplight, rubbing the bridge of his nose in frustration. Reports indicate German units have breached critical defensive lines near Leningrad, and Southern forces continue their methodical push toward key industrial cities. Every attempt to reorganize reserves is hampered by shortages, frostbite, and the relentless pressure of the Wehrmacht. Citizens huddle in shelters and basements, ration lines growing longer, hope growing thinner. The absence of American intervention is no longer a hypothetical. It is a stark, tangible reality shaping every strategic decision. In Berlin, Hitler's generals feel a rare sense of unimpeded opportunity. Without the looming threat of American forces across the Atlantic, resources that would have been diverted to the Western Front or shipped to aid allies are now concentrated on crushing the Soviet Union. Fuel, artillery, and armored units move with efficiency previously impossible. Plans are drawn for potential encirclements and occupation strategies that in reality would have been countered by American aid to the Allies. On the streets of Leningrad, children learn to differentiate the sound of incoming artillery from the whistle of bombs. Soldiers scrape together meager rations to survive another day. Every day is a battle of endurance, yet morale, though strained, refuses to collapse entirely. In this alternate timeline, the Eastern Front teeters on the edge of catastrophe for the Soviets, a direct consequence of a United States that chose observation over engagement, leaving the world's balance of power precariously in Axis hands. The Mediterranean Gambit, mid-1943, Sicily and Italy. The Sicilian sun casts long shadows across olive groves and narrow mountain roads as German and Italian troops fortify their positions in anticipation of Allied landings. In reality, the U.S. would provide massive air, naval, and ground support for the invasion of Sicily. But in this alternate timeline, America's absence leaves the Mediterranean theater largely in British hands, struggling to project power with limited resources. Commanders pore over maps and aerial reconnaissance reports, calculating the risk of frontal assaults against well-prepared Axis defenses. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, overseeing Axis operations in Italy, walks among his officers, nodding approvingly at newly constructed bunkers and artillery placements. The absence of U.S. military might means that Allied bombers are fewer and less effective. Logistical challenges compound as Britain must rely on stretched supply lines from North Africa and Malta. Soldiers on both sides sense the heightened stakes, with Axis troops confident that their opponents lack the full complement of American firepower, while British forces push forward cautiously, aware that any misstep could spell disaster. In London, Churchill and his war cabinet debate the feasibility of further Mediterranean offensives. Every plan is scrutinized for risk, with advisors reminding him that without American support, decisive victories become more elusive. Meanwhile, intelligence reports from intercepted German communications suggest that the Axis is emboldened, willing to take calculated risks, knowing that American carriers and bombers will not arrive to tip the balance. The Mediterranean thus becomes a theater of tension, where every movement is magnified by the stark reality that the United States, the most industrially potent and strategically influential nation, has yet to intervene. On the ground, Italian civilians move cautiously through bombed-out towns, watching soldiers fortify positions that may never be attacked by American forces. The landscape itself becomes a testament to the alternate world unfolding. The Axis occupies a Mediterranean corridor more securely, while the Allies struggle to adapt with limited manpower and material. Every decision, every skirmish echoes the profound impact of one nation's choice to remain on the sidelines, reshaping campaigns that could otherwise have turned the tide of the war.
The Axis consolidates, late 1943, Western Europe. The winter chill spreads across Western Europe, frost clinging to the forests and fields of France and the Low Countries. German forces, unchallenged by American intervention, consolidate their occupation of conquered territories. Supply depots overflow, rail networks hum with activity, and armored divisions rotate between the front lines and rest areas rejuvenated from the absence of American air raids. Hitler's inner circle meets in the Reich Chancellery, confident that the strategic balance has shifted in their favor. Occupied France sees a subtle but growing tension among civilians. Resistance networks operate under increased secrecy, aware that without U.S. military pressure, liberation seems further away. Underground fighters sabotage rail lines, communication hubs, and supply convoys, but every action is measured against the overwhelming might of a Germany unencumbered by a second front. German officers, aware of the potential for rebellion, yet reassured by the lack of American threat, implement harsher policing and intelligence operations to maintain order. In Britain, Churchill issues statements to maintain morale, but internally the reality is grim. Without American industrial support and troop reinforcements, plans for an eventual cross-channel invasion are deferred indefinitely. Military advisors calculate the diminishing chances of a successful landing in France, weighing every operation against the growing strength of fortified German defenses. Meanwhile, German engineers expand the Atlantic Wall, constructing bunkers, minefields, and anti-aircraft positions that could stymie any late-arriving Allied forces. The psychological weight of America's absence pervades every strategic calculation. From Berlin to London, Paris to Moscow, every general, soldier, and civilian understands that the decision of one nation to abstain from war has fundamentally altered the rhythm of conflict. Germany, free to maneuver without fear of the U.S., tightens its grip on Western Europe, creating a sense of inevitability in the Axis's expansion, a stark and unnerving reality that will shape the months and years to come.
Japan's empire expands. Early 1944. Pacific Islands. The turquoise waters surrounding the Solomon Islands glisten under the tropical sun, but beneath the beauty, the air is tense with the roar of Japanese aircraft and the rumble of naval artillery. Japanese forces, facing no American opposition, continue to fortify captured islands and expand their reach across the Pacific. Supply ships navigate coral reefs with precision, bringing fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements to garrisons that would have otherwise been threatened by U.S. carriers.
Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his flagship, studies maps that reveal the vast expanse of a nearly unchallenged empire stretching from Southeast Asia to the South Pacific. Local populations on islands such as Guam, Wake, and the Philippines watch as Japanese troops consolidate control with ruthless efficiency. Without American intervention, guerrilla resistance is suppressed more quickly, and Japanese planners consider pushing further toward Australia and New Zealand. Airfields and naval bases are reinforced, while elite units train for hypothetical strikes against distant targets, plans that in the real timeline would have been impossible due to U.S. naval dominance. Back in Tokyo, military strategists debate the long-term implications of continued expansion. The absence of American forces allows for a focus on infrastructure, logistics, and offensive readiness. Confidence is high. The United States, the industrial and military giant that could have tipped the balance, remains neutral, leaving Japan in control of critical resources and strategic positions across the Pacific. Every victory, every fortified island, strengthens the perception that the empire can shape the future of the region unchecked. Meanwhile, Allied forces, particularly the British and Australians, scramble to adjust strategies in a world where one powerful nation remains absent from the war. Supply lines stretch perilously long, and every engagement must be carefully measured against the risk of encountering a fully concentrated Japanese force. The Pacific Theater, once contested fiercely with American intervention, now demonstrates the profound consequences of a single nation's decision to abstain from conflict, reshaping the global balance in ways that will echo for years.
Across the bustling streets of New York and Chicago, factories hum with activity, producing goods not for war, but for domestic consumption. The United States, having resisted entering World War II, channels its industrial might inward. Automobiles, household appliances, and consumer goods flow from assembly lines at unprecedented rates, fueling economic growth and prosperity. Politicians and business leaders celebrate the avoidance of war's destructive costs, but global observers take note. The industrial power of America, fully intact and uncommitted, looms as a silent juggernaut on the world stage. In Washington, D.C., military planners draft contingency plans for potential future involvement, but for now, isolationist sentiment dominates policy. Congress debates foreign aid cautiously, limited to humanitarian assistance or minimal supply shipments to beleaguered allies. Citizens, buoyed by the prosperity of peacetime production, largely support restraint, believing their nation can remain untangled from Europe and the Pacific. The Pearl Harbor attack, though still a national trauma, is memorialized without triggering immediate military retaliation. Meanwhile, Axis powers closely monitor American industry with both envy and apprehension. Germany, enjoying freedom on the European front, calculates that without U.S. intervention, they can consolidate gains and potentially dominate the continent. Japan, controlling vast territories across the Pacific, watches the distant industrial colossus and debates whether eventual American engagement will become inevitable. The tension lies not in immediate confrontation, but in the looming potential of a fully mobilized United States, whose eventual entry could dramatically shift the global balance. Banks, ports, and railways in the U.S. operate with unmatched efficiency, fueling innovation, infrastructure, and scientific research. Resources that would have been devoted to mass production of war materials now enhance domestic development, creating a society that is economically strong but militarily restrained. The world watches, calculating, waiting. Every military victory by the Axis is shadowed by the silent, untested power of a nation that has chosen observation over engagement, a power that could reshape the outcome of the war if ever unleashed.
The Axis Summit, late 1944, Berlin. The chandeliers in the Reich Chancellery cast long, flickering shadows across the polished floors as Hitler convenes a summit with his top generals and ministers. Maps are spread across the table, pins marking conquered territories, supply routes, and potential future targets. The absence of American intervention has emboldened the Axis. Germany has solidified control over Western Europe, North Africa is within their strategic grasp, and Japan's expansion in the Pacific continues unopposed. The leaders speak with confidence, almost hubris, unaware of the latent power that America represents across the Atlantic. Hitler's eyes linger on the map of the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union continues to resist but suffers immense losses. Generals argue about pushing deeper into Russia, contemplating encirclement strategies and resource grabs that, historically, would have been challenged by the eventual U.S. push from the West. In Berlin, the atmosphere is thick with expectation. The Axis believes that the world is within their grasp. Every plan, every deployment assumes that the United States will remain a passive observer, a calculation that could not be more precarious. Meanwhile, Japanese envoys report the consolidation of their Pacific territories. Every island secured, every airfield fortified, every supply line reinforced contributes to a sense of inevitability in Tokyo. Japan and Germany, while not formally coordinating all operations, recognize that the absence of American intervention allows unprecedented freedom to pursue their ambitions. Strategic planning becomes bold, aggressive, and unrestrained, guided by the knowledge that one of history's most powerful nations remains neutral. Yet, beneath the veneer of confidence, subtle concerns linger. Senior officers acknowledge that the U.S., though uninvolved, could still shift the global balance with mobilization. For now, however, the Axis basks in the consequences of American restraint. Europe and the Pacific, both theaters of immense strategic significance, are quietly reshaped by one nation's choice to remain on the sidelines, a decision that could define the war for years to come.
Across continents, the war has taken a drastically different shape. In Europe, German dominance is nearly unchallenged, with France, Belgium, and the Low Countries firmly under Axis control. The Atlantic remains perilous for Allied shipping as U-boats roam with impunity, while Britain struggles to maintain supply lines and morale without American support. In the East, the Soviet Union endures crushing losses, its forces weakened and territories occupied, forced to fight for survival with diminished resources. Across the Mediterranean, North Africa remains a contested but largely Axis-favored theater, delaying any potential Allied resurgence. In the Pacific, Japan's empire stretches from Southeast Asia to the Central Islands, consolidating its strategic advantage. The Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies are firmly under Japanese control. Australia and New Zealand prepare for potential advances, but face logistical challenges and limited support from a Britain already overstretched. The absence of American carriers, aircraft, and troops has allowed Japan to fortify key positions, creating a buffer that would be nearly impenetrable if the U.S. continues to abstain. Within the United States, political leaders and citizens debate the wisdom of continued non-intervention. Economically, the nation flourishes, industries hum with innovation, and unemployment remains low. Yet global observers watch warily, calculating the potential consequences should the United States finally enter. Historians in this alternate timeline speculate endlessly. The Axis enjoys a nearly unchallenged expansion, but one fully mobilized America could reverse the course of events almost overnight. The world stands at a precarious balance, where victories and losses are defined not solely by battles fought, but by the monumental impact of one nation's restraint. The stage is set for a future that could diverge in countless ways. Every decision, every hesitation, every unmade declaration of war echoes across oceans and continents.
leaders of all nations understand that while the Axis may dominate today, the potential for change remains, suspended in the tension of a world where the United States has yet to unleash its full power, a silent, looming presence capable of reshaping history entirely.
The year is now 1945, and the world teeters on the edge of a historic divergence. German forces, having consolidated Europe and crushed much of the Soviet resistance, stand at the peak of their power. Japanese control in the Pacific seems unassailable, islands fortified, fleets resupplied, and airfields bristling with fighters. But amid this apparent dominance, the question that haunts leaders and historians alike is inevitable. What if the United States finally decided to intervene? Across the Atlantic, American industry continues its relentless hum, producing the tools of war that, in this timeline, remain untested. Strategic planners imagine the scale of mobilization required to confront the Axis powers alone, and the sheer force that could be unleashed if America entered fully prepared. Aircraft carriers, bombers, tanks, and trained troops sit poised, their impact deferred, but not erased. The very absence of action has created an environment in which the eventual U.S. entry could produce consequences far more dramatic than in our history. A single intervention capable of toppling Axis gains with overwhelming force. Meanwhile, civilians and soldiers across occupied territories and embattled nations live with the tension of uncertainty. Each day is shaped not only by the Axis's movements, but by the lingering possibility of a massive, game-changing intervention from across the ocean. The war's trajectory is fragile, balanced on the precipice of one nation's decisions. In classrooms, war rooms, and government offices alike, the thought persists. The United States' choice to abstain has reshaped global conflict in profound ways, creating a world where victories, defeats, and the very survival of nations hang in suspense. This alternate history scenario reminds us of a singular truth. The tides of war are not determined solely by battles fought, but by the decisions made or not made by those with the power to intervene. The U.S. remains a silent giant, its absence felt across continents, its potential influence the defining shadow over a world poised between triumph and catastrophe. History, in this version, is not yet written. It waits, suspended in the tension of what could have been.